This has been a disaster. All right, so first time with a hot tent, and I said, well, first time with a hot tent, and I had such high hopes. I had some really brilliant shots thought out, and honestly, this has been a disaster. Where I'm at is just 2 miles in from the highway, and it took me probably about 4 hours to get here. Hardly anybody's been up here. A few maybe a snowshoer, cross-country skiers. There's about 5 feet of snow as far as I can tell. So followed the tracks, which was kind of hard packed, but ended up being a trough of snow, narrower than my sled. Probably should have turned back. Got here pretty late. Had a hell of a time with everything. Gonna try to cook something, I guess. And we'll talk about it in the morning. Well, I think this is going to be one of those what could I have done differently videos. At least I got a fire going. Cooked a steak. And we'll see how everything looks in the morning. Good night. All right, so this whole thing was a disaster, and I think getting out today is not going to be much easier. But when we're back in the studio, we'll talk about it. So, see you guys soon.
Okay, so what was that all about? So earlier this week, I went on my first trip camping in the winter with a hot tent. In preparation for that, I got myself a hot tent, a foldable wood stove, and I modified a toboggan into a folk sled. Checked the weather, did some research because here in the Willamette Valley of Oregon, it rarely snows. So I looked for an appropriate place to go. And what I found was a place called Gold Lake near Willamette Pass, about an hour and a half south of here. That trail didn't seem to have a lot of elevation. In fact, it's a road to a campground, but it's closed in the winter. So did my research there. Looked like it wouldn't be a lot of elevation, just 2 miles hiking. And I called the ranger station to see if I could camp there since it's closed for the winter. And I packed my stuff and I went. Now, in that found footage, I mentioned that trip being a disaster. So, what did I mean by that? All right, let's get into it. All right, so when I arrived at the snow park there, I could see that my destination was across the highway. And across the highway was a wall of snow about 5 feet high because of the snow plows. So I parked and I walked up there to scope it out. And it appeared that there was a track going through where the snow had plowed. And on the other side, a hill going up, and 2 sets of tracks made obviously by skis. So I knew I wouldn't be able to get the sled up that. So I spent a bunch of time going back and forth across the highway and packing all of my gear by hand, and brought the sled and loaded it up and tied it down, and then took a good look at that path. And it was about this wide. And my sled was about this wide. But I figured I'd give it a shot instead of just bailing after driving an hour and a half. And the first thing I noticed was, even though I had an enormous amount of weight on that sled, I was able to pull it all right. It slid on the snow pretty well, even though I was going uphill. Now, as I went uphill, this track narrowed a little bit, and I found there was a lot of scraping on the sides, and the snow was frozen. So basically I was cutting a knife edge through the snow on either side of that trough, which was anywhere between 6 inches high and 1.5 feet in places. So the pulling was a little harder in a lot of the spots. And as I went on, I found that it was taking a little more effort than it would have if everything had been packed. And because of that narrowness and the frozen aspect of the snow, after a while, my sled went up on its side. And so I had to go back and ride it, and it kind of loosened some of the tie downs. And I went on, and it happened again and again. And that was a bit frustrating. And so the tie downs became looser. I was tired, questioning my choices, and I didn't really take the time to tie it down really well again. Moving on, some of this track got very, very narrow, to the point where I was really working my thighs trying to pull this sled through. So it was taking an enormous amount of time. Now, I had given myself a couple of hours to go 2 miles, knowing that it might be kind of slow. And that was not even close to how long it ended up taking. So as I went on, I got to points where this track became so narrow that my sled was getting stuck, and I was having to just lunge forward just to break it free. And in doing so, I broke a carabiner. Now, when I had modified this toboggan into a bulk sled, I'd used a system of poles, and it was working out really well. But the carabiners I used, I just grabbed out of a drawer, and most of those carabiners were just freebies from Gossamer Gear at Pacific Crest Trail Days. They're not meant for load bearing. Fortunately, I had a system where I was using 2 on one end, and so I was able to modify that and continue on, but it was taking an enormous amount of time and effort, and I was getting sweaty, which is a terrible thing when you're in the snow, and dehydrated. because you don't really think about that in the snow. So after some time, I saw that the track on the other side seemed a little wider. So I decided I was going to lift the sled out of this trough onto the other side. As soon as I stepped into the snow that was between the two tracks, I went up to my waist. And the only reason I didn't go further is because of anatomy. So now I've got snow in my boot. I'm having a hard time getting out of there. I'm seeing that that's not going to happen. I've got my snowshoes, but they're on the sled. And so I just decided to keep going and look for possibly a wide spot somewhere where I could turn this thing around and maybe just bail on this trip, because it was taking a long time. And then tipped over again and again, and was stuck again, and broke another carabiner. And I'm losing stuff off of the sled and having to jump onto the other track and go back and jump back to put things back on the sled. At this point, I'm not even bothering taking time to tie it down correctly. I'm checking Gaia to see how far I've gone. It's been a quarter of a mile, but there's nowhere to turn around. And as I start to crest the top of this hill, I see that there's tracks going off at other trailheads. And so there's fewer people going to where I was going. And so that track was even narrower. But there was no good way, without unloading the whole sled, picking it up over my head, turning it around, and going back through what I had just gone. I just kept going. And that was a questionable decision. But at this point, I knew as long as it didn't get any worse, I would get there. And then it got worse. It did even out a little bit to where it was easier to pull. And then I came to an area of a bunch of runoff with little snow bridges. It was sort of like a little maze. And so I was having to pull the sled, holding it right at the very front, walking backwards, looking over my shoulder, and hurrying across these little narrow snow bridges so that I didn't dump the whole load into the water below. And I did get across that. And that is one of those areas is some of the footage I took. Now, going into this, I had all kinds of ideas about the footage I was going to take. Beautiful shots set up like I would backpacking. And seeing how hard it was, I knew that wasn't going to happen, not the way I envisioned. And I also knew I wasn't going to go off trail and set up a tripod because I would sink up to my neck. So eventually, I was just stuck. The snow was so deep in these tracks and so narrow, I couldn't pull it any further. I broke a third carabiner. I didn't have a replacement. And I just grabbed it with both arms and tugged, and the whole thing went over again. And at that point, I wasn't sure what to do. So I checked Gaia. I had another less than a quarter of a mile to go. Most of it was downhill. So I abandoned the sled and I hiked on to see what it was like. And it didn't get any better, even though it was downhill. But eventually I got to Gold Lake Campground, and everything was buried in snow. The bathrooms that are there, the snow was up to the top of the doors. So there was no looking for the campsites, because I would have just sunk up to my head looking for those, because there was just one set of tracks going off of this main trail. But there were two fairly flat areas. So I decided I was going to try to get the stuff down there, even if I had to pack it. So I went back. It had tipped again, so I just put a few things on it. And I took the snow shovel and I started chopping snow all the way down to the campground and came back, and I was able to get the sled down. And then I went back for another load of stuff and packed it down, and then a third. So eventually I got everything to the campground. At this point I was completely exhausted and disillusioned, and I checked the time and it was 3:30. I had started around 11 o'clock and I had gone 2 miles. So that was a disaster. And now I was racing the darkness. So I chose a spot. I started to follow those tracks. I sunk up to my thigh. So I put on my snowshoes, went to the flat area I found, and I started stomping it down and stomping it and stomping it and stomping it, trying to make a flat place for a tent. And I spent a lot of time and energy doing that. And then I grabbed the tent and stakes and pole and came back still wearing snowshoes. I set the tent out where I wanted it to go. And I started to stake it out with snow stakes. And I knew I should bury these, stomp them down and let them freeze for like half an hour. But I was running out of daylight. So I set the stakes as well as I could, which was a little awkward with snowshoes. So I took off the snowshoes and immediately sunk up to my thighs, put them back on, staked out the tent as well as I could. And then I took the center pole, which is a 7-foot pole, placed it in the middle into the snow. And as I put pressure on it, it sank and kept going down until I stopped it when there was only a foot left showing above the snow line. So now I was a little concerned. So I took the case, the carrying case that my snowshoes come in, and I placed that down on the snow in hopes that that would give enough resistance to where I could put the pole up. I put the center pole up and immediately all of the snow stakes came out and it all collapsed. So I started with the stakes again, and they weren't going to stay. So I did a dead man sideways and buried them. And again, the tension pulled several of those out. And now the sun was going over the horizon. And I was a little concerned in that there's a warming shelter there with a stove. I had firewood, but I really didn't want to sleep in a 3-sided shelter. So I ended up getting the tent up, and fortunately there wasn't really any wind. And at this point I was completely exhausted. Started lugging things over, brought things into the tent. As soon as I took off my snowshoes to step, I sank up to my knee. So stomped around inside some more. I was able to get the footprint down on one side. And before it got dark, I put together the cot, knowing that I couldn't sleep directly on the snow. So that went together fine. Got my sleeping pad and sleeping bag out. And I just sat down. I was starving. I was sweaty. My feet were wet. My hands were wet. I was just done. Found a couple of pieces of cheese and ate those. Drank a ton of water and started putting together the stove. And it has the chimney that rolls out, which is a monster of a time the first time, but I previously burned the stove, so it rolled out all right. Had some problems with it and got some little ripples in it, but I got it together. And I knew burning the stove, it's going to melt snow below, so I needed a little platform. So I just put a piece of wood under each end, under the legs. What I should have done at that time is put a row of wood under there. But it worked. I got a fire started, no problem. And I was grateful for that. And set up the thermometer. But at this point, I was so hungry, I was so tired, and now it was dark. And that sucked. Also broke a zipper on my backpack because there's gear straps on the backpack, and I was going to use those to pull the sled initially. What I didn't notice was I had hooked it up to the zipper on the hip belt. And after about 50 yards, that just tore off. Didn't realize till I got home that was my zipper. But so that sucked. Definitely, I probably should have considered turning back, but seeing how hard it was to just even step outside of that track, I think I got just in a very rigid mindset. And then I considered camping along the way when I did find some flat spots. But I knew as soon as I stepped out there, I was going to go up over my head. Like I was hoping if I got to the campground, since it was close to a lake, that there would be less snow on the ground or more people had been there. That just wasn't the case. So I was probably camped on 7 feet of snow or 8. Just a little creepy, but it worked out okay. So after I got the fire started, I was able to get out of my boots, brought these neat little slipper boot things, and my feet were wet as hell, but that was helpful. And then at that point, I was okay. As long as the tent was going to stay up, I knew I'd be all right. Of course, at this point, I was drinking out of a gallon bottle of water because somewhere along the way, my Nalgene, which I would have heated up at night to stay warm, had been lost along the trail in one of those tip overs. So now I'm in a tent with a terrible pitch, saggy areas, a little concerned that that's going to sag toward the stovepipe, but that ended up not being a big issue. But it was certainly on my mind after the day I had had. And because it was getting dark so soon, it was completely disorganized. I just had shit everywhere. So I had a hard time finding things, but did find my frying pan, found my steak. And so I decided to try cooking. And that's the one thing that went pretty well. The stove worked great. Cooking on the stove worked great. For some reason, even though I was lugging probably 80 pounds worth of stuff, I brought a spork with a steak. So that was dumb. So yeah. And then I mentioned the foundation for the stove. So as it burned, it made a nice little hole underneath. And at some point in the night, that caused my little platform to shift because I just have one little piece of wood there. I was able to fix that, but it could have been a bad thing if the stove had just completely fallen over. But I was able to fix that, and that was a learning lesson. But yeah, I definitely used too much time and too much energy getting there. And so everything I had in mind, it just didn't go that way. I felt fortunate to get the tent up and have a place to sleep. So at the time, I felt like it was a disaster. So decided to chop some kindling, and that didn't work because I was on 7 feet of snow. So even putting down a piece of wood, to put a piece of wood on it, to chop it, just tamped it down. But I did get a fire started. Moving forward, I'd probably just split that at home first, unless I'm cutting firewood out there. I did bring firewood knowing as a first time trip, I should be prepared and not put more on myself. So I'm grateful for that. So what went right during this found footage horror movie of mine? Like I said, I took almost no footage because I didn't want to delay getting there. And once I was there, I didn't give a shit. I was so exhausted. So this ended up not being that kind of a video. But everything I shot I've shown you, and that was all on my phone. So that's what I got. So what did work? I've got a bunch of new gear I was trying out, and we'll look at that in another video, but just quickly going through, I bought a backpacking cot. Comes in a bag. It's only like 7 inches off the ground, more like 3 or 4 since I was sinking in the snow, but it worked. It worked really well, actually. So that definitely went well. The footprint I used pretty much saved me because that helped disperse the weight so the cot didn't sink into the snow, and it gave me a dry place to put my stuff, so that was great. And I got to try one of 2 0-degree bags that I picked up after that sleeping bag video. This was the Kelty 0-degree down bag. We're going to talk more about that one later, but it worked really well. I was wearing just some cheap thermals and a beanie and some socks. It kept me warm, and it got down to 24 degrees. I woke up a little cool from the waist up to about my neck. But again, cheap thermals. And so the bag, it works really well, because usually when it's cold and I'm sleeping in a sleeping bag, I'll end up with my down jacket, and I didn't need that. So that was great. Also used a real pillow, a smaller one, contoured, that I picked up at a secondhand store. That worked pretty well. And I got the indoor-outdoor thermometer. I thought it'd be a good idea to be able to compare the temperature in the tent and outside the tent. That worked out really well. So I'll be using that moving forward. I also got a cool little string light thing. I'm not going to show that to you now. We'll go over the gear in another video, but I've been rambling on. But nice little light. You can take the cover off, and it's a set of string lights, and that was really cool. If I had had time to set up a camp appropriately, I would have hung those up. I just kind of strung them everywhere and had a couple of little lanterns to see by, but those were really great. If the trip there had been better, if I had a better destination, those would have been super cool. Also got a fan for the top of the stove, a thermal fan to move the air around. That worked really well, even though it's kind of big and heavy, so we'll look at that later. And I will say the stove worked great. It got nice and toasty. I was able to cook on it. It kept me warm and cozy well until I went to sleep, so definitely grateful for that. That went well, surprisingly. Mentioned the first slippers. Those are great. They take up a lot of room. I think on the next trip, I just need to bring less stuff, for one thing. And I also mentioned the thermals. I'll show you what worked out of those. My bottom half was great. I had 2 different brands. Those are amazing, so we'll look at those in another video, and I'll leave a link to them because they're the best I've used, for sure. And I will say, I was pretty nervous the second day, and I forced myself out of bed, and I took a lot of time packing everything very well, tying it down very well, and knowing it was going to take a long time to get out of there. And it was hard going uphill with all that stuff. But since I'd broken the trail, it was not nearly as difficult as when I came in. And so it went surprisingly quickly. In fact, I only checked Gaia once to see how far I'd come, and that was at a 1/4 mile. The next time I stopped to check it, I heard traffic, and I didn't need to check it because I was out. So definitely, if this had all been packed well, I think I would have had a great trip, except that there was nowhere to pitch a tent that wasn't 5 feet of snow. So besides that, yeah, a better track would have been a better time. So what did I learn for next time? Well, yeah, there's going to be a next time. I shared my experience when I got home. The response was, that sounds miserable. And when I mentioned the next time I go, that was met with some surprise and disgust. But yeah, there's going to be a next time. And what I learned was, and I've talked about these things, when I went to Summit Mount Hood in May and it was whiteout conditions, I said, have a backup plan. And I did. And if you haven't watched that video is up here. And that's the first time that I wasn't on a mountain where I actually camped in snow, but not prepared to camp in snow. So this time I was prepared to camp in snow, but I didn't really have a backup plan. I told myself I was going to get up there, I was going to look at it. If it looked like it was doable, I would do it. If it didn't, I would come home. After I came home, I did some more research. And I found a second destination 5 miles closer to my house 1,000 feet lower in elevation. And when I was looking at the snow reports, where I had gone on this trip, 60 inches of snow, and 5 miles down the road, 18 inches. Nice, beautiful, wide open space, half-mile hike to the second highest waterfall in Oregon. I mean, what the hell? So, that's my plan for next time. So, I didn't really have a backup plan. I could have gone down there if I'd known about that place, if I had planned that through. So, next time, I do have a backup plan to that backup plan. So, that was something I learned. I also learned that in modifying the toboggan to make a pulk sled to pull my gear, I had a very sound design. It worked great, except that I used basically garbage carabiners. So I'm going to replace those, and they'll work pretty well, I think. I also had a belt that I used to hook that up to, which I'm grateful for, because in the end, I just tied that belt to the sled because I'd broken so many carabiners. The belt works great. I'll replace the carabiners. I know not to carry so much shit for sure. And less firewood. I brought a lot. I used less than half of it. So I learned that. Again, I mentioned the foundation for the stove. Next time, we're going to do a row of wood, put the stove down there. It's not going to melt the snow as much, and it's going to be more stable. So I learned that. Also, in trying to put more wood in there, had to kind of stoke around. Shortly after that, I smelled what smelled like burning rubber. Found the next morning that even with the spark arrestor, I had actually burned a tiny hole in my tent. So something to pay attention to. So yeah, I really felt like going only 2 miles in on what was reported to be a very popular snowshoeing route was going to be the safest, best choice for me to have a good experience. I didn't really consider how much snow was going to be up there, or the fact that it wouldn't all be tamped down, that there would be just 2 little runs. But, you know, I'm new to it, so now I know. Now I know where to go, and this time I'll be able to actually use some camera equipment and hopefully show you guys a good time. So thank you guys for watching. Hopefully I'll see you next time.